That takes about half a second to be consciously aware of what we're seeing. So our awareness is about half a second behind reality.
So why do we feel fear?
I would say we feel fear for several different reasons. I think the most straightforward is it is probably the most important emotion for survival and thus the most important driver of evolution. If we could not be afraid, we would be quickly eaten by predators long before we evolved as humans. I think the human condition is about how do we have this emotions like fear that can totally take over, and how do we regulate them so we use them when we need to and not be completely driven by them all the time.
You mentioned this is something that we share with other animals. Do we feel it differently than other animals? Do we seem to feel it more or less or about the same?
I don't know that we know. I think that's the thing about animal research is we can learn a lot by observing their behavior, but they can't talk to us. So
It's a significant hurdle, right?
fear in humans is mostly a subjective thing. One person's fear is not the same as another person's fear all the time. So we really need to talk about threat-related behaviors or fear responses, because we really do need to separate sort of the subjective conscious sense of fear, um, which can have a lot of the components of anxiety and anticipation and all those things, from sort of the very behavioral component of fear, like that sense of panic, that sense of I'm just running for my freaking life.
Do we feel fear in the way that we used to? Because I would imagine, like back when we were prehistoric times, I was afraid of the lion coming to eat me. Now I'm afraid of social interaction.
I think that's both one of the very exciting components of fear and also one of the problems. Where I think it gets really interesting is where we are today as a species. We've gone, in the last 100 years has been more social evolution than probably all history before. And now we're doing things like online podcasts and 24/7 news cycles, and we've got all our smartphones and our computers and everything. And we're all exposed to the whole world all the time, and we're not just exposed to our immediate family or our tribe or the hunter-gatherer situation. We're just sort of overwhelmed with what potentially could be fearful events. So that might be everything from feeling scared about a war in another continent, being scared about the potential of the politician that we don't trust going the wrong direction, and so much of current politics is driven by fear, or being scared that people don't like me on social media. And so there's all of these components where there's still this base emotion of threat and fear, but there's now this sort of secondary things on top of it. And I think that, is a large driver of why we have such high levels of anxiety and stress today.
Yeah, are we kind of using it in the wrong way? Like this thing that was supposed to warn you about the lion is now responding to, oh my gosh, am I going to use the wrong word in this email to my boss?
Exactly. I think so. We didn't evolve for the world we live in. And so we have these basic emotions that are really hundreds of thousands of years old in their circuitry. There's minimal evidence that human evolution over the last several 100,000 years has changed much of anything, particularly related to basic emotions.
Is the flaw with the foundation and the design in it, or is it the flaw with the application that we are now using it for? Does that make sense?
I think the simple answer is that we've evolved past our social evolution, and our technological evolution has evolved past what our biological evolution prepared us for. The big irony, I think, is that the 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 evolutionary drive that may have been most important beyond like mating and having babies, um, for survival, may be the thing most likely to kill us as a species, because it's also, I think, underlying fear that drives xenophobia and drives cycles of violence and drives wars. And so it is, I think, a quite an interesting thing.
Getting back into like less existential questions, like when we feel fear, what's happening in our brain?
It's cool because it's one of the best understood neural circuits of how brain connectivity leads to a specific set of feelings or emotions or behaviors. So I'll walk you through an example I often show when giving a talk. Let's say you're walking down. So my favorite sort of somewhat funny metaphor to use is that my wife is deadly afraid of snakes. So what's going on is we start with the sensory emotion. So in the case of seeing the snake, your eyes are constantly pulling in information from the world around you on a microsecond, millisecond level. And the first place the eyes send information is a middle brain place called the thalamus. And the thalamus then has two projections. One of them goes to the visual cortex, higher multiple levels of visual cortex, and then finally up to sort of frontal cortex and where we have what we think is consciousness and awareness. That takes about half a second to be consciously aware of what we're seeing. So that by itself is an interesting observation. We're always, our awareness is about half a second behind reality.
Some more than others, I think.
Some maybe minutes.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that middle thalamus region, the first part of the brain that gets information from the eyes, sends another neural projection down to the amygdala. And this is this area just inside the ears. And the amygdala is really the part of the brain that evolved for very rapid emotional sensory detection of the world around us. And so it's getting this sort of pre-processed information, and it very rapidly, within two sections within the amygdala, sends hardwired projections to many different brainstem and subcortical areas that activate the temperature response, the breathing response, the stomach upset response, the startle physiological response, the sweating response, increasing blood pressure. That all happens in about 100 milliseconds. So well before hundreds of milliseconds before you're consciously aware of seeing that thing, your amygdala that's prepared for the snakes of the world has already set off, this might be a snake, fire, fire, fire. Will Robinson run, and it activates all. And then you kind of become consciously aware, oh, why am I feeling this way? It's just a stick. But your heart's already racing, you're already sweating, you're already doing these things. So that's kind of the thing we all go through all the time.
So we're reacting to it before we even consciously recognize it.
Exactly. It's a driver of our behavior, and it had to be, because the systems evolved to have an extraordinarily rapid fight or flight system, right? So that you can get the hell out of Dodge before you get eaten, and you need to be reacting faster than you can think about whether you should run or not. So that's the basics. And then when you think about people, and we all have some level of that, and we all can think of the stories in our head. But if you think about things like post-traumatic stress disorder, that's a case where somebody had a severe trauma, and now they are responding like that all the time, inappropriately, overly generalizably. They can't get out of the house. They're avoiding things. So it's that fear reaction has just gone to 1,000, and they can't control it. Or with like people with significant general anxiety, they're sort of always feeling on edge, even if they don't quite know why. And it's because that amygdala system is just sort of always ramped up and always feeling like they're at threat, even if they're not.
So then how can we control something where our body's reacting before we're even aware of it?
You often can't in the moment. And a lot of our therapies, are about that process. So some kinds of therapies, one's called dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, but it's really just emotion regulation. And it teaches you ways of, okay, even if I'm feeling out of control, if I'm feeling like I'm dying, I have to cognitively know that I'm not. And this is the whole range of cognitive behavior therapies. And how can you train your body to calm down, train yourself to believe your behaviors and the facts around you and not your emotions. So part of it's really just psychoeducation. Your emotions will lie to you, and they're often not that accurate. That I think is, again, sorry for keep coming back to politics, but as you say, we're prisoners of the moment. I think that's part of the issue. Politicians that can speak to emotions are much more successful in getting votes than those who speak to cerebral and logical issues. Because
Yeah.
at the end of the day, we make decisions by our emotions, and that's we're really well trained not to. And then
Yeah.
other kinds of therapies and way we can treat it are things like post-traumatic stress. You essentially retrain the brain that those cues and the things in the world that remind you of the trauma are not actually dangerous. And you do that in part just by re-experiencing them. So if you're afraid of snakes, I keep trying to convince Betsy to do this. You have to you have to have exposure therapy with phobia. So you would start by maybe sitting in a room with a snake, going to a zoo with a lot of snakes, then holding a snake, maybe having a pet as a snake. You're retraining the brain that these things that I'm naturally afraid of, I don't have to be. And with trauma, it's that was a horrible thing that happened, but it happened at that time by that person in that place. And it's not all the people who look like them, and it's not all cars or whatever. So that's
Do,
the general idea.
when you kind of look at exposure therapy, is it something that like, okay, this really works or this works better than anything else we got?
The latter. Most things in mental health, um, nothing, don't work as well as we'd like them to work.
Yeah.
And so exposure therapy is has the best evidence of the types of therapies we use in the phobias, in post-traumatic stress disorder, in obsessive compulsive disorder, and those sorts of things. And we really think now that our what we call traditionally anxiety disorders, and those be like phobias, OCD, social anxiety, social phobia, and then post-traumatic stress is sort of the most extreme. We think of all of those as really fear-related disorders or disorders of the fear system.
Is fear more nature or nurture in the sense that like can you look at someone's physiological makeup of their brain and say that person is going to really struggle with fear? Or is it a thing that we like learn as we go throughout life?
It's both nature and nurture. We're starting to be able to answer that more quantitatively by doing large scale genetic studies. So twin studies, where you take you know identical twins and you follow them over a lifetime, and people did a lot of this in the 70s and 80s, and then now that genetics has gotten a lot cheaper, we mostly do large scale genetics. But the twin study suggests that disorders like post traumatic stress disorder or severe anxiety, that those probably have about a 30 to 40% genetic basis. So that about a third to a half of your risk for having really severe fear is genetically inherited. But that means at least a half to two-thirds is environment, and is nurture, right? And we know that the environmental component is both early development, and that's childhood trauma, childhood adversity, and childhood neglect are often the biggest risk factors for almost everything in psychiatry. But they're certainly not alone, and there's certainly people who have some of those things and turn out fine. But it's certainly one of the big risk factors. Another is just level of trauma or threat or stress over one's lifetime. So um, um, living in a lower resource environment, having less mental health resources, having, broken families, all the things that are bad put you
Yeah.
at higher risk for all these things. And part of that's because the more unstable, the more uncertain your life has been in the past, the more your fear system is sort of like, I don't know when I'm safe and when I'm not.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll kind of divulge some personal information. I came from a very stable environment, and I'm generally not very afraid of things, and I don't have very much anxiety. Other people that I know who have come from less stable environments have way more anxiety.
And just one thing, we did a study of about 15,000 people in inner city Atlanta, and we asked literally thousands of questions. And we did imaging, and we did biology, and we did all this stuff. Inevitably, one of the biggest most powerful variables of significant depression or post-traumatic stress in adulthood was a very simple. So we'd ask a lot about different kinds of childhood trauma, but if you simply asked, did you grow up in a stable or unstable household? However you interpret that, that was a huge predictor. So saying whatever would make somebody say, no, it was pretty unstable, and that sort of forced yes or no question was highly correlated with much more risk.
Does it seem to be when somebody develops like one of the more extreme negative reactions to it? Does it seem to be a quality or a quantity thing? Like this needs to happen a lot, or no, you just have to have one or two really bad experiences?
It's an additive process, which you could probably get through multiple ways, right? So I think one or two really bad experiences may be sort of equivalent to a lot of sort of minor experiences.
Yeah,
so
right.
so that
Like,
it's some total dose response curve that we don't really understand. But one term in the field is called trauma load. It's how the loading of how much trauma you've had over your lifetime seems to shift you to more and more risk. That said, there are certainly some examples of what we call traumatic growth, or basically building resiliency, that if you have some level of maybe not so much trauma but unpredictability or stress, but that you can overcome it or have the right social supports, parental supports, others, that those can build resiliency and can build confidence that you can overcome difficult things, right? And so that's, I think, one of the interesting dialectics of discussion between, well, all trauma is bad versus, okay, now we have a snowflake generation in which nobody can handle anything, right? So what is it? So there's something about independence, something about overcoming difficult situations, but that's very different than obviously being physically attacked, being sexually attacked, being bullied all the time in school. So it's all about, I think, part, as you say, the quantity or the level of trauma.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like you got to get to the proverbial number 10, and whether you get there through 2 5s or 10 1s, once you get there, you're there.
Yeah, and that's mediated in part by, and that's kind of how we think the gene by environment, the nature and nurture work. The nature, the genetics probably partly sets what that threshold is for how much you can take. And the nature and the nurture is how many, how do you get to 10? Or for one person, it may be 20, and another person, it may be 5. Yeah, for the threshold.
So when we feel fear, like what is it that our body wants us to do?
There's several different sort of hardwired reflexes to the fear response. So the classic terminology is fight, flight, or freeze, and that pretty much wraps it up. So first is is defend yourself if you can't escape. The second one is run away if you still can escape, and the third one is if neither of those are going to work, freeze, and maybe they won't see you. and and so this makes a lot of sense, like with rodents, right? So if you're a little mouse, and there's you see a snake coming near you, well, they've evolved, and a lot of this is because your predators use motion to detect the prey. So that's why they just sort of freeze and hope not to be seen. But once the predator's close enough that it's clear they're seen and they're not going to freeze, then emotion will cause them to startle and run. And so a lot of the circuitry is starting to be figured out about what's the difference between when that same fear input is telling you to startle and run or to freeze, or if it's another animal that might be wanting to attack you. Again, when they're far enough away, if it's maybe two males fighting over territory, when are they far enough away you can ignore them, freeze them, or run away, versus when are you going to have to fight? And so
Yeah.
there's a lot starting to be understood about that. Now, as far as humans, how does that work? The fight one kind of makes sense, and you can, certainly see people who are more disinhibited or are afraid or fighting. The cycles of violence, I think, come to that. The freezing's a little harder, but an example of that is, giving a talk, or being on a first date and your mouth's dry and you can't think of what to say and you're just kind of stuck. And in more severe PTSD, that looks like what we call dissociation. People's eyes may roll back. They sort of almost feel like they're in an out of body experience. They're just so entirely separated from the present moment.
When we feel that fear emotion, can other emotions override it? Or is this like, nope, this is the only thing you are paying attention to? Like, kind of like when I'm cold, all I think about is the fact that I'm cold. Nothing else matters.
Yes, it can be, though it's hard. So a panic attack is a good example. So I don't know how familiar folks are with the panic attack, but the idea is you might be fine, you might be a little anxious, and then all of a sudden it feels like you got to get out of there. You're dying, you're sweating, your heart's racing, and you just got to escape. But in that panic attack, the treatments that we can tell people are, one, there are things like meditation, but it can be really hard when all your cylinders are firing to meditate. And then you mentioned being cold. Actually, one of the most interesting techniques is ice diving. And you may not go whole body, but they'll tell people to put get a bowl of ice water and stick your face in it. And in people who are really suffering with a lot of distress and sometimes complex trauma, they might cut themselves, and that's of course not a positive way of dealing with
Yeah,
it.
it's
But
like,
these are all things that basically bring the sensory world in so strongly that they help you get grounded and kind of take yourself out of your mind that is right now being so much in this fearful space.
I have a family member that they can kind of get going, for lack of a better word, but then they'll grab an ice cube and it seems to like reset.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, that's what's that basic idea is behind a lot of these tools that are really about grounding tools or distraction tools that are essentially taking a really strong sensory cue and having you focus on that, so that sort of takes that attention away from the fight or flight motion. And it doesn't always work 100%, but it can be a helpful way of pulling yourself back down.
Are you ready for some harder / listener submitted questions?
Oh, sure.
Does fear change throughout ages? Like, is there an age where we seem to be more fearful than other ages?
Most anxiety disorders, and therefore most severe fear, start in earlier in life, and whether that be, um, probably the peak of when it really starts to get impairing is in the teens and 20s. Um, and but it seems, again, back to the kind of nature nurture thing. Anxious kids often grow up to be anxious adults. And really shy kids often have to grow up to be kind of introverted, kind of quiet adults. And so it doesn't things like PTSD is probably the only one of this batch that seems to go where people are kind of fine, then a horrible thing happens, and now they're different. Most of the other anxiety spectrum disorders have been there at some level since usually pretty early in development. The two differences are postmenopausal, because estrogen has such a huge effect on everything, that women who may have had some anxiety or depression predilection, but who were doing pretty well, sometimes in the postmenopausal period, a lot of that can come back, and that's what sometimes feels similar to postpartum with the changes then. And then with early dementia, also, as people lose some of their cortical ability to sort of control their emotions, they'll start to get more dysregulated and fearful and agitated. And a lot of agitation in people with dementia is really, I think, anxiety and fear.
What is the difference between fear and anxiety? Is that the same thing, or just kind of like, no, this is just a lesser version of fear?
The simple answer is they're more alike than different, but there's interesting other answers. And so there's two different brain regions. I talked about the amygdala. There's another brain region that's a little more forward in the brain and a little smaller that's kind of in the middle of the brain, and it's called the BNST, bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. You didn't know you get a neurology lesson today. So it turns out they both get similar inputs and they have similar outputs. So both regions can drive that panic attack. But the amygdala is more activated by things that are more close to attacking you, that sort of almost immediate attack. And that's what we think of more with sort of that immediate fear response. The bed nucleus, the BNST, seems to be more activated by distal threats or more general unknown threats, um, unpredictability. And in rodents, you can model this by the amygdala is more activated if the mouse is right up to it. If the attacker is right up to it, that's going to more likely attack the amygdala. The BNST is more activated if there's like a looming bird or a sound of something off in the distance, but they can't see it. And so it seems like there's some evidence that that unpredictability is more anxiety, and that's more of the BNST. And it's more about distal threats. You know there's something going to happen, but you're not sure what to do, and that may more activate slowly going away or going down in your burrow or kind of hiding out from other people. And the amygdala, which is the close-up threat, is what the more fear is about, and that's more the jumping the response, a lot more of the immediate physiological reaction.
Is there kind of another shoe to drop or another cost to pay? And that if we're feeling this fear and anxiety so much more than we potentially were at the past, or somebody is feeling it a lot more than somebody else, like, does that take a toll on our brain or our body in a different way?
Yeah. Well, at the extreme level, well, I mean, I can talk about this in multiple levels, right? Um, Anxiety disorders, particularly PTSD, are some of the highest risks for suicide. I also think that a lot of violence is, I think, about fear and anxiety, and particularly fear. Um, I think biologically, people with severe anxiety disorders and PTSD have higher risk of dementia when they grow older. So there's some nature nurture effect of Alzheimer's and other dementias as well. There's both a biological component, but a lifetime of stress increases that risk as well. And then what we're starting to understand a lot about is the intersection of emotions in the brain with the immune system. And it turns out that people with severe anxiety, PTSD, and fear are more likely to have a more inflammatory state. They're more likely to have perhaps alterations in their appetite. They're more likely to be at risk for other kinds of physiological disorders like cardiovascular disease and even cancer. So that chronic stress, which is often the outcome of dysregulated fear, can be a risk factor for many other biological component disorders too.
Are we more fearful than we have been in the past?
I think the emotion of fear is probably similar, but I think number of things, the number of opportunities we have to be afraid and the number of things that can drive our fear are much, much more. It's not to take away from, obviously being in a war zone any time in history is a horrible thing, or being in an abusive relationship or a dangerous family or something. But I think for the average person who may not be in a war zone, et cetera, your exposure to fearful cues because of social media, because of 24/7 news, because of the increasingly, um, you know, small size of the world, while that has many positive things, it really has a lot of activation of our fear circuits as well.
What is the reason? Like, why do we like scary things?
I think that's where it's kind of the adrenaline rush, and there are some people who um, they like that the really the feeling of the rush, the feeling of their body, the feeling of the adrenaline, but they can also know that they truly are safe. So they're able to both hold both of those things true. Yes, I'm feeling all this as if I'm not, but I know I'm going to be okay, and that actually feels very exciting or rewarding to them.
Have you ever seen anybody that was like incapable of fear? Like they just didn't have that emotion whatsoever.
I personally have not. I mean, there's stories. So there's some very interesting examples of people who have a inborn disorder where actually their amygdala degenerates, and they've they they don't have the same sense of fear that the rest of us do. They know that there's this concept in the literature about fear, but they don't seem to feel it physiologically or the same way. I think the more common is at some level things like sociopathy. They've been shown to um, people with very severe narcissistic personality disorder or sociopaths that they don't seem to activate the amygdala in the same way that others. And what that's about, I think, is still not quite sure. The thought that most of those folks probably had a very early trauma and they sort of probably dealt with it somehow by just sort of flipping the whole thing and not, but for the most part, it is very rare.
How does a fear? Oh, how does a fear become a phobia? Like not a phobia that's I'll use this word. I don't mean this word legitimate, but like I'm afraid of doorknobs. Like how does something like that happen?
Yeah, we don't really know actually. It's because most data suggests that people with pretty significant phobias had them from very early on. So that people with fear of heights had them from very early on. People with fear of dogs or snakes had them from very early on. So then there's the question of, well, the traditional learning and memory theory is that that phobia is really just an overly learned fear, but as opposed, but it's very specific in the cues. Um, but there's definitely people like that for whom they can say, okay, yeah, I remember when I saw a dog chase me down the street, and ever after that I would just get so upset when I saw a dog or whatever. And but the others are less clear. And one thought is that, so there's certainly the possibility that one of the stories in the field is that we perhaps don't, while we're not inborn with specific fears, we maybe have evolved to be more fearful of certain kinds of things than others. So we're generally more likely to have phobias of predators like canines or sharks, snakes, than we are of gerbils.
Yeah, that makes I understand that.
Yeah,
Like that makes sense.
and what's interesting is we're not there aren't any phobias of guns and cars, and that's what kills everybody. So there's some maybe some evolve predisposition towards certain kinds of things than others. Um, the other is that thinking about development of emotion, there's a lot of data that our amygdala is active from very early in birth, right? And you can see that with brand newborn babies; they're just kind of all emotion. They're either giggling and happy, or they're crying and screaming, right? Or very easily startled. But we don't actually develop the parts of the brain for our more explicit memories and our declarative memories until about 3 years old. So we have 3 or 4 years of developing emotional memories and social memories and experiential memories before we have any definitive memory of them. And so you could certainly imagine that's plenty of time to have been chased by a dog or seen a snake or gotten too close to a window and gotten afraid without really having a declarative memory about that event.
Is there anything that it would be considered like what's the universally scariest thing?
In MRI scanners, when you're looking at the brain activation, it is actually seeing another person be afraid. And so you can have people look at all sorts of scary pictures and horror movies and everything, but if somebody has this look of, this full terror, that most traditionally activates the fear system. And so the thought is there that we socially empathize, we socially mimic, and that may be one of the most universal things that make us afraid is seeing somebody else be afraid. And that's also one of the thoughts about maybe how phobias and some anxiety works is that it may not be so much, it doesn't have to have been experienced yourself. If you saw a family member or somebody else, you saw a parent be really afraid of something, you have observational fear.
That's pretty much all the questions I got. What are you kind of studying now? How can people learn more about your work?
Um, let's see, I'm at McLean Hospital, so you can look me up at the McLean Hospital website or our lab website, wrestlerlab.com. And we're studying both on the human side, large scale studies of genetics and neuroimaging, and postmortem studies. It's a very exciting time in the field. People have known about postmortem studies of neurological disease for a long time, like Alzheimer's and other ways to understand the brain. But we now have the molecular tools to understand the molecular aspects of brain regions related to mental health disorders. And so that's really leading to a next generation of tools and approaches and understanding. And then we also study at very basic mechanisms how these regions like the amygdala work, and can we develop new medications and other kinds of therapies for decreasing the fear response in a therapeutic way.